In this episode, we are going to build a beginner-friendly understanding of data classification and the protection requirements that follow from it, with a focus on making those requirements hold up under scrutiny rather than collapsing into vague labels. Data classification sounds like a paperwork activity until you realize it is one of the most practical ways an organization decides what deserves the strongest protection and why. Classification is the act of grouping data into categories based on sensitivity, criticality, and impact if it is misused, altered, or unavailable. Protection requirements are the specific expectations that apply to each category, such as who may access the data, how it should be stored and shared, how long it should be kept, and what level of monitoring is needed. Beginners often assume classification is only about secrecy, but it also includes integrity and availability concerns, because some data must be accurate and available to support critical operations. Requirements that hold up are requirements that can be explained, applied consistently, and defended in audits, incidents, or leadership reviews. If classification is inconsistent or protection rules are unclear, people will label data however they want and security will become uneven. When classification is meaningful, it becomes a common language for security decisions across the organization. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong starting point is understanding why data classification matters in the first place, because it is easy to misinterpret it as an attempt to control everything equally. Organizations create and use enormous amounts of information, and not all of it carries the same risk. Some information is public and can be shared freely without harm, while other information could cause serious damage if exposed, such as personal data, financial details, sensitive operational plans, or critical system configurations. Some information might not be secret, but if it is altered, it could create harm, such as medical records or financial transactions, where integrity is crucial. Some information might not be sensitive, but if it becomes unavailable, it could stop operations, such as schedules, inventory data, or service configuration details. Classification allows an organization to focus protection where it matters most, which is both a security and a business efficiency benefit. If everything is treated as top secret, people will ignore the rules because they feel unreasonable. If nothing is treated as sensitive, people will share freely and create preventable incidents. A good classification approach creates proportional protection, meaning the strongest controls are reserved for the highest impact data. That proportionality helps the requirements hold up because they feel justified rather than arbitrary. Now define what good classification looks like for beginners, because a common mistake is confusing labels with decisions. A label like confidential or restricted is not useful unless everyone understands what it means and what behavior it requires. Good classification starts with clear criteria, such as the type of data, legal or contractual obligations, business impact, and the harm that could occur if the data is exposed, altered, or unavailable. Criteria should be simple enough that non-experts can apply them, because data is handled by many roles, not just security professionals. For example, if data includes personal identifiers or sensitive personal information, that may trigger a higher classification because of privacy obligations and trust impact. If data includes intellectual property or strategic plans, the classification may be higher because exposure could harm competitiveness. If data is essential to delivering a service, the classification may include availability requirements because downtime creates immediate harm. Beginners often assume classification is something security assigns to everything, but in mature programs, data owners and process owners often participate because they understand business impact best. Security provides the framework and oversight so classifications stay consistent. When classification decisions are made with clear criteria and appropriate ownership, they are easier to defend. Protection requirements that hold up are built from the idea that classification must drive action, not just documentation. That means each classification level should have defined requirements for access, handling, storage, sharing, retention, and disposal. Access requirements typically include who can see the data and under what conditions, such as least privilege and role-based access. Handling requirements include what people must do when they use the data, such as avoiding sending it through uncontrolled channels or ensuring it is shared only with authorized recipients. Storage requirements include expectations like encryption, secure backups, and approved storage locations. Sharing requirements include whether the data can be sent externally, what agreements are needed, and what controls are required when it leaves the organization's boundary. Retention requirements include how long the data must be kept and why, balancing business needs and legal obligations with the risk of keeping data too long. Disposal requirements include secure deletion so sensitive data is not accidentally exposed later. Beginners sometimes treat these requirements as technical rules, but many are behavioral and process-driven as well. Requirements hold up when they are clear enough that people can follow them and when they are enforceable. A major beginner misunderstanding is thinking classification is only about confidentiality, as if the only question is who can see the data. In reality, classification should also reflect integrity and availability needs, because different data types have different failure modes. For example, data used for financial reporting may have integrity requirements that are as important as confidentiality, because incorrect data can lead to wrong decisions and legal consequences. Operational data used to keep services running may have availability requirements that are critical, because if it is unavailable, the organization may stop functioning. When classification includes these dimensions, protection requirements become more complete and more realistic. You might protect integrity through controlled changes, approvals, and audit trails that show what changed and why. You might protect availability through redundancy, backups, and recovery planning. These protections can be framed as part of the classification requirement, not as separate technical projects. This perspective helps requirements hold up during incidents, because you can explain that the data category requires not only secrecy, but accuracy and uptime. When you include all three dimensions, classification becomes a true risk-based tool rather than a secrecy label. Another important concept is consistency, because classification systems fail when they are applied unevenly. If one team labels similar data as low sensitivity while another labels it as highly sensitive, the organization ends up with inconsistent protections and confusion. People then lose confidence in the classification system and begin ignoring it. Consistency comes from clear definitions, training, and oversight, but it also comes from designing classification categories that match how the organization actually works. If categories are too many or too complex, people will not apply them correctly. If categories are too vague, people will interpret them differently. Many organizations succeed with a small number of levels, such as public, internal, confidential, and restricted, but the exact names matter less than the clarity behind them. What matters is that each level maps to specific requirements that are easy to communicate and enforce. Consistency also requires periodic review, because data use changes over time, and a classification that was accurate years ago may not be accurate now. When classification is treated as a living system, it stays credible. It is also crucial to connect classification to data lifecycle, because protection requirements must follow the data through creation, storage, use, sharing, and disposal. A common failure is to classify data at rest, like in a database, but ignore how it moves, like in reports, exports, emails, backups, and analytics. When data moves, it often crosses boundaries and reaches people who do not normally handle it, which increases risk. Classification should therefore drive requirements for how data may be exported, how it may be shared, and what controls must exist when it is transmitted. This does not require technical detail. It requires policy clarity and process discipline. For instance, if restricted data must not be sent through personal email, that is a handling requirement derived from classification. If confidential data can be shared with a partner only under an agreement, that is a sharing requirement derived from classification. Lifecycle thinking also helps during incidents, because responders need to know where sensitive data may have traveled. If classification is tied to lifecycle, it becomes easier to identify exposure and contain it. Protection requirements also must hold up under real operational pressures, which means they must be usable and not encourage constant workarounds. If requirements are too strict for normal workflows, teams will bypass them, and bypassing creates uncontrolled risk. A mature approach designs requirements that are strong where they need to be strong, but also supports people with approved methods to accomplish work securely. For example, if teams need to share sensitive data internally, the program should provide approved channels and guidance that make secure sharing easy. If people need to collaborate across teams, the program should clarify how to grant access appropriately without endless delays. Usable requirements are more likely to be followed, and followed requirements are more likely to hold up. This is why security programs should seek feedback from process owners and users, because they can reveal where requirements create friction. Friction can be reduced through clearer rules, better processes, or better support, without lowering protection where it matters most. Holding up means surviving reality, not just being correct in theory. Another area beginners should understand is how classification connects to external obligations, because many laws and contracts effectively classify data even if you do not use the same words. Personal data often triggers privacy obligations, and certain regulated data types may have specific protection requirements and reporting expectations. Contracts may require that certain data be protected at a specific level or that certain controls be applied, and these requirements can define minimum protections for certain classifications. Determining protection requirements that hold up, therefore, includes mapping classifications to obligations, so that when someone asks why a rule exists, the answer is clear. If a classification rule is linked to a regulatory obligation or a contract commitment, it becomes easier to defend and more likely to be taken seriously. This mapping also helps avoid accidental violations, because teams can see which data categories carry special restrictions. Beginners sometimes treat classification as purely internal preference, but obligations can make certain protections non-negotiable. When classification is aligned to obligations, it becomes a compliance support tool as well as a security tool. Finally, classification must be supported by governance, because someone must own the classification scheme, maintain definitions, and resolve disputes. Disputes happen when teams disagree about sensitivity or when classification affects cost and process requirements. Without governance, teams may choose classifications that are convenient rather than accurate, and the scheme loses integrity. Governance includes defining who can set or change classifications, how classifications are reviewed, and how exceptions are handled. It also includes ensuring that protection requirements are auditable, meaning evidence exists that the requirements are being followed. Auditable does not mean heavy bureaucracy, but it does mean that key decisions and access patterns can be reviewed. When governance is in place, classification becomes a reliable basis for decision-making across the organization. It supports consistency, supports accountability, and supports trust. Without governance, classification becomes a set of labels that people argue about without resolution. In conclusion, determining data classification and protection requirements that hold up is about creating a clear, consistent way to decide what data needs what level of protection, and then translating those decisions into practical, enforceable requirements across the data lifecycle. Classification is driven by sensitivity, business impact, and obligations, and it must consider confidentiality, integrity, and availability rather than focusing on secrecy alone. Protection requirements must be clear about access, handling, storage, sharing, retention, and disposal, and they must be usable so people follow them under real operational pressures. Consistency comes from simple categories, clear criteria, training, oversight, and governance that resolves disputes and maintains the scheme over time. Mapping classifications to external obligations and contractual commitments strengthens defensibility and reduces accidental noncompliance. When classification drives real behavior and is supported by governance, the protection requirements hold up during audits, incidents, and leadership scrutiny because they can be explained, applied predictably, and proven in practice.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.